And if you have your Bibles, ladies, this is not Tuesday. Would you turn to John chapter 19? Now, if you do not have a Bible, we have Bibles in the back over by the poinsettia. We have the year Bibles, which a lot of us here at the fellowship are going through, and I would encourage you to grab one of your own and get on the Bible bus. Again, the beauty of it is God's really using this particular Bible to get us all on the same page, giving us, yes, a unity, a harmony, but also a like mind for the things that He longs to do. We also have some other Bibles there, all free for the taking. Again, as I mentioned last week, I will never buy a Bible. Well, I don't want to say never, but hopefully next time in our round of Bible buying, I'll get the giant print. You know, like you're all struggling. But please take a Bible. Again, if you do not have one, they're yours to keep. We have 3 different Bibles back there for you to choose from. I dare you to take one of each. Yours. John chapter 19. And as you know, if you were to look to the right, you'll discover that we're coming to an end of this gospel. Again, a gospel that we've spent a year going through, and in some ways it's bittersweet. Teaching through John has certainly showed me much about the deity of Christ. Now, it's a gospel I'm familiar with, having taught through it before, but when we get ready to transition, as we're going to keep on going, we're going to see through the book of Acts the birth of the church. Of course, this is upon the ascension of Christ, and we're going to see the church being born. Now, the book of Acts I have not taught through before. Yeah, so I know you'll probably see me being blown away, so perhaps you'll accompany me and be blown away alongside. So I'm excited about that. Wednesday nights we've been hitting the minor prophets. We're currently in Zechariah chapter 8. We would encourage you guys to come as well. It's our night of prayer. How I long we had more time dedicated to prayer, that time of thanksgiving, that time of intercession, that time of requests, petitions, where we ask God help. So I would encourage you to come out Wednesday night. We've been doing Old Testament, the OT, and this morning here we are in the New Testament. So if you have your Bible, please turn to John chapter 19. And by way of recap, and my intent is to complete this chapter this morning, so that way next week we can get to chapter 20, where we're going to discover there in Jerusalem there is a tomb that Christ was buried in, although we're going to glean that it was on borrowed terms alone. If you go to the tomb today, is He there? No. He is risen, and we'll find an empty tomb. But for sake of recap, let's pick up at verse 17. So John 19, verse 17. And He, referring to Christ, was bearing His cross. And He went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. So here we see the writer giving to us this picture. We see the burden of Christ having to carry the cross. And again, it's very much illustrative to the burden or the weight. Again, the cross or the Roman cross would have been this literal, large, and heavy object. It would have been constructed of like large wooden beams. Perhaps you could liken it to the wooden ties that we see along the railroad tracks. Again, it would have been a literal bearing that He had to carry, but certainly it was more symbolic of the death He was getting ready to die. For as we've discovered through John, that Jesus would be crucified as a criminal. He would be condemned to death. And of course, the location geographically would be here in a place called Golgotha. Now, as I mentioned before, the intriguing part about it, because of the criminal's death, he would now have been legally killed outside of the city gates. Now, as you know from going through John, it's the time of Passover. And certainly there was much festivities taking place. In fact, we're going to discover, especially as we finish today, that part of the Jews' request is that they didn't want to have these bodies hanging from these crosses while the pilgrims were coming into the city to worship in the Passover. But the city would have been crowded, and here were these 3 criminals, according to the Jews, hung on crosses. Verse 18. Where they crucified Him, 2 others with them, 1 on either side, and Jesus in the center. Of course, we covered this a couple of weeks ago. Now Pilate, verse 19, he had wrote a title. Again, this is indicative of a sign or a placard. And he had put it on the cross. So he made the sign and he had nailed it to the top of the cross above each criminal's above each person. Christ is not a criminal. He's not. And he's a man who knew no sin. Again, he is the fullness of God. He was that perfect person. And what we're going to discover today, that as he lived a perfect life, there was also a perfect death for the Messiah. Again, this is something that needs to be stressed. But above there in verse 19 it says, and the writing was. Now, as I mentioned, it would have been proper to have legal notification of the legal charges or the accusations posted for all to read. And this is what it says. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And then many of the Jews, and again here's these Passover crowds, these Jewish pilgrims, read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. Now, of course, as I mentioned, it was outside the city limits, but nevertheless, it was on public display. Again, this would have been very notorious or infamous death. It would have been for all to see, for all to be a witness. And it says it was written there in 3 different languages. Hebrew for the Jews, Greek most likely for the Gentiles, and Latin for the Romans. Now, of course, we know from studying this gospel that most likely these were the common languages at the time. But what I love about the application is that here, based upon the legal charges, all demographics were covered. In other words, anyone at the time who had been walking by and would have been able to read it in their own indigenous or native tongue. In other words, the truth of Christ would not have been concealed or hidden. It would have been a very public matter on display. Therefore, the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, don't write it. In other words, the implication there is change this. This is a mistake. This is an insult. And yet for us as the reader, how it's very ironic. It says the King of the Jews, but he, being Pilate, said, or referring to Christ, he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. In essence, it's going to stand or it's going to remain. And then the soldiers, verse 23, when they had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and they made 4 parts or 4 piles, to each soldier a part. In other words, it was now divided up. And also the tunic. Now the tunic here, it says, was without seam, and it was woven from the top in one piece. And as I mentioned this before, it's identifying this particular garment as being an expensive one. Then they said, therefore, among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, now here we see John quoting Psalms 22, verse 18. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things. Now again, one more time, and I've mentioned this before, an attribute of Christianity is fulfilled prophecy. As we look at all the world's religions, we are the only one that can say that our Messiah, upon his arrival, it was prophesied over 300 times, and each one to a T had come to pass. No other religion can say that. We're also going to discover that when it comes to his second advent, which just simply means his second coming, there are also about 200 prophecies, and every single one, within the manner of the first, with the second, will be fulfilled. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 regarding fulfilled prophecy. This is verse 18. And here I'm going to read out of the New Living Translation. Again, it's neat the way it's recorded. He says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and the earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law or his word will disappear until its purpose is achieved. Again, a very unique attribute of Christianity is our fulfilled prophecies. Again, God said these things would come to pass, and guess what happened? They came to pass. But here's where I want to pick up today. We're here in verse 25 as we're going to complete the chapter. And what we're going to notice is that there's now an audience being assembled there at the foot of the cross. And we're going to look at that. And this is how 25 reads. Now there stood by the cross Jesus' mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, although Mary be from Magdala. But what we discover here is there at the cross, in his presence or near him, they would have been close to Jesus during his dying time. This is the audience at the foot of the cross. Again, here we see first we see his mom. Second, we would find his mother's sister. Now we believe from Mark 15 and Matthew 25 that her name would be Salome, and she would actually be the mother of James and John, or the wife to Zebedee, the wealthy fisherman, although Zebedee, I believe, is his last name. And Mary, the wife of Clopas. Now she is found in Matthew 27, and many believe that she's actually the mother of James the Younger, who was also a disciple. So these ladies would have been a familiar audience to Christ. And then finally, Mary Magdalene, which we find in Matthew 21 and Mark 15, that she was demon-possessed. But as we observe these things, certainly we can interpret things as well, but there's always an application. Again, as we would read that, we have to reflect on our own life. Are we near the cross? Is there a season of life where we spend our time or take up our residence near Jesus at the foot of the cross? It's the cross that changes lives. It's at the cross that we find the intimacy of Christ. It's at the cross where we discover his suffering in our stead. Again, he went to the cross in your place. And that's the gospel. Again, that because he would go, which is certainly good news, but the better news is that he experienced the wrath of God, though we were the ones who rejected God. He went in our place. Again, we are now justified because of what he has done. Verse 26. And when Jesus therefore saw his mother, and again here from the eyes of Christ we would see signs of compassion. Again, the enduring pity of Christ. Again, the nature of God through Christ is one that cares. He cares. Now, Peter would say when it comes to this truth that we should cast our cares onto him because he cares for us. But what's cool about that exhortation or that admonishment is that followed by that in verse 8 is he tells us to be sober and be vigilant because our enemy, Satan, he roams around like a lion, seeking whom he might destroy. So as we're casting our cares over to him, we still have to be in that state of mind and that attitude of being sober-minded, understanding what Christ did and that there is an enemy after us. But what I love about this verse 2 that we can glean was that Christ, as the eldest son, had a responsibility to his mom. One of the commandments we discover is to honor thy mother and thy father. Now, for some of us, as we would find a personal application, we instantly examine or scrutinize the honorability of our parents. Yeah? Right? Oh, man, so how's that look like lived out? It's not about how it looks like lived out. It's a matter of your element of obedience within your heart. The word says honor them. But they're dishonorable. So what? Well, they abused me. They neglected me. Did all these things. They don't even know the Lord. So what? You honor your parents because the Scriptures command it. And if you, some parents are smiling right now. Yeah, as their children are sitting to their left, right? And this goes for me too. My mom, who's in California, is embarking on a move to relocate here in a couple of months. And since we've moved out here, our relationship has changed a bit because we're now separated by about 1,900 miles, so we don't have that same intimacy. And my wife and I are preparing not just our home, but our hearts for her arrival. Will we honor Mom as the Lord would command us to? We're asking God to fill our hearts with the love of Christ, that when she comes, she would be embraced as being received by Christ himself. So we're preparing our hearts. More love for Mom. More love for Mom. And if she's listening to this right now, I love you, Mom. Right? And he's preparing our hearts. And the disciple whom he loved was standing there. Now we know from the Scriptures that this was identified by John, the author of this particular gospel. And he said to his mother, now Jesus is speaking from the cross. He says, woman. Excuse me. And again, woman is very much a term of endearment, but this is probably, it's a translation to our English language. But he says, woman, behold your son. So as we sit there and we look at that verse and we take into the perspective of Jesus, we see his love for man. First for his mother and now for the disciple that he loved. And he proclaims there, behold your son. In other words, as my responsibility, I'm now handing it off to a capable and qualified caregiver. Again, he will now become your offspring as if you had begotten him. He will be your benefactor and he will be your provider. Again, this would assure proper care for his earthly mother. Again, the beauty of the Scriptures, as we see profiled in the person of Christ, is an example that we can follow. He's dying, and he's like, hey, take care of my mom. And yet we who aren't on death row, are we able to take care of our parents? Again, there's a lot of application there. And again, I think even in my own heart right now, the conviction is setting in. Right? Am I honoring my parents? And yet here now, Mother Mary would be taken care of from John. And then he said to his disciple, notice here that the relationship has benefits for both. He says, behold your mother. Again, here I think we can glean, again, this speaks of John's character and perhaps even his own personal need. But in essence, honor her, and this is a stewardship to you. And from that hour, the disciple, John, took her to his own home. So basically from that very moment or immediately, he would now move her into his residence on a permanent basis. Mother of Jesus just moved into John's place. And after this, verse 28, knowing that all things were now accomplished. In other words, all things desired by the Father have come to an end or have come to their finish, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Again, that which was fulfilled essentially is fallen man is redeemed. But what we see here is from the cross a picture of suffering. And this would be the sixth statement of Christ. He says, I thirst. Now check this out. Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there. Now the interesting thing about the sour wine is it's something that was commonly drank by the soldiers. Now soldiers lived on a laborer's wage. So this would have been the cheap stuff. Again, this would have been cheap wine with a vinegar base. But it also would have acted as a sedative or a painkiller. It would have been something, and for those of you that drink cheap wine, you know this truth, right? It would lessen the pain and it would deaden the function. But ultimately, what we need to glean, it is a pitiful picture of the world's mercy. The best thing the world can offer you is cheap wine to deaden the pain, to lessen the things that you are going through. Again, it is the best thing that the world can offer is cheap booze for your pain. Again, a very shallow picture of mercy. And here they're offering it up to Jesus. And they filled a sponge with sour wine, and they put it on hyssop. Now here what we need to understand about hyssop, it would basically have been like a palm branch. So it had been functioning as an extension, and they put it to his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he then said, and this would be his final statement, it is finished. Again, speaking to the absoluteness of his death. Nothing else, small or large, is required. Again, no additives or no just in case. We discover by Christ the sufficiency of the cross and his shed blood. Again, this is adequate for us as the sinner. But what is finished? It's pretty simple. The plan or the way of salvation. Again, the redemption of fallen man. The remission of sin. Again, the wrath of God is satisfied. Prophecy is fulfilled. And the Father's will is completed perfectly. And it says there that he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. Now what we need to learn from that is Christ is acting voluntarily as our substitute. It was him who dismissed his spirit. Again, the perfect life would now have the perfect death. Listen to what John said in chapter 10, verse 18. Christ speaking about his death. He says, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. In many ways, Christ wasn't murdered, but he gave over his life, and he dismissed his spirit. Therefore, because of this, verse 31, it was preparation day, speaking of the eve before Passover, and the Sabbath getting ready to begin, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken down. So the Jews went to Pilate to seek permission that their legs would be broken. Well, why would their legs need to be broken? Because what we discover is that when someone is hanging on a cross, oftentimes they use their legs as pushing strength. And the moment that their legs are removed, they now set into suffocation or respiratory failure. In other words, it would accelerate the suffocation process. If we break their legs, they'll die quicker. And then we can get that shame off the hill. After all, it's party time. The Passover is here. In essence is what they're saying. Again, that they might be taken down, or better yet, or taken away, better yet, taken down. And we find this in Deuteronomy 21:21. Then, verse 32, the soldiers came, obviously adhering to that request, broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with them. Now, how did they break their legs? Well, they would have taken an iron mallet and crushed the kneecap and caused it to shatter. Boom! Added the sound effects. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. And of course, we can confirm that by looking at